Tehseen Noorani. The title of his talk is Teaching New Tools, Critical Pedagogy and Psychedelics as Plant Teachers. So he's a research scientist and adjunct professor in science and technology studies at New York University's Tandon School of Engineering. He has done also field work in the Johns Hopkins lab, observing the research on psilocybin. And in his previous studies, he has addressed the phenomenon of people that hear voices and claim that that's legitimate. So he's exploring a wide range of limit experiences. Please welcome him.
Thanks. Oh. Hello, everyone. Okay. Thanks, Pia, and to everyone organizing the panel. It's just before lunch on the last day, so we're getting there. Gonna hang in there. The title of my presentation is Trickster Pedagogies, from Teacher to Tool and Back Again. I want to use the time here to consider what risks getting lost in translation when we move from the idea of plant teachers to cognitive tools. What might it mean to take seriously as more than a metaphor the idea of psychedelics as teachers within Western contexts, such as US-based clinical trial research and serious psychonautic investigation? That question has led me to document how psychedelics offer trickster pedagogies. And what I will suggest is that by focusing on psychedelics as teaching us, rather than healing us or doing something for us as tools, that highlights the time period immediately after the acute experiences and the factors that are involved in ensuring that the meaningfulness of the experiences endures. So, yeah. Okay, first from teacher to tool. So Ken Tupper, in a lot of work, and recently with Bia Labate, made the case for strategically assimilating psychedelics into a Western milieu by calling them cognitive tools. It makes a lot of sense in some ways. The idea of cognitive tools avoids animist presuppositions by suggesting that psychedelics themselves are not agential, and that we might get to a stage where their mechanisms of action will no longer surprise us either. The idea of cognitive tools inspires a techno-utopian pursuit of individual optimization, and it's been argued that tools are empowering because they're things that one can own, control, and master. At the same time, Tupper has cautioned that if we call psychedelics tools, it means we have to respect their power as tools that can be misused. But respect for, say, a knife is quite different than respect for a teacher, which much more forcefully loops an unknowable other into one's experience. What's more, those who seek the optimization of psychedelics-assisted interventions imagine a future where legitimated clinicians or service providers will be able to ascertain when people will need psychedelic psychotherapy. But there are good reasons to think that that's not possible, that these substances are simply not that controllable, and therefore cannot be successfully enrolled into procedures that rely on them to produce a certain effect. We're far from achieving, for example, 100% rates of hitting a mystical experience in the clinical trials, and that's with very narrow screening requirements. Oh, okay. But then, why instead look to the indigenous idea of psychedelics as teachers? For one, there are some who make a kind of psychedelic exceptionalism amongst drugs, either claiming that there's, we may have heard like uniquely meaning-making substances, or they're non-addictive as drugs, and so forth. Those who want to emphasize the psychedelic exceptionalism might benefit from marking that exceptionalism with this unusual idea of teachers rather than the very common notion of tools. Also, teachings need to be absorbed, which points to how integration takes a kind of work something that we often acknowledge in these conferences is sidelined in the research on psychedelics. And part of that includes this idea that the value of experiences can get realized over time. It's not sort of set in stone at first. Okay, if we go down the teaching route, who are the teachers? How can we understand psychedelics as teachers? Well, they could be the psychedelic drugs themselves or techniques for achieving psychedelic experiences, what Tom Roberts calls psychotechnologies. They could be an aspect of or an entity encountered within the psychedelic experience, as is common in a kind of indigenous documentation of indigenous practices. There could be the psychedelic experience itself, like in toto. That's often the way it's understood, I think, in the clinical trial context. What was the narrative arc of your experience and what does it mean for you? There could be oneself, myself, my reactions, my reflections to the psychedelic experience. I think of Neil Goldsmith's idea of not blaming the flashlight for your responses to what it illuminates. And they could be human figures as teachers, whether guides, shamans, monitors, therapists, the different configurations of these figures as the research progresses or as the kind of second wave progresses, let's say. We might also identify the teachings in different ways. What are we being taught about? Could be something outside of me. That's kind of like these Terence McKenna-inspired experiments, the great download of something. They could also be the lens or the aperture that opens unto the something outside of me. I think of Christina Callicott's work on Icaros. There could be myself, teachings about myself, and with a similar logic, the mirror that reflects me back to me. It's what is the nature of that mirror. Or they could be something that permeates everything, so that we find inside of me and outside of me, and therefore to look in one place is to sort of learn something about the other, and you can correspond across the two. So Jeremy Narby's work in 99 on DNA, but other tropes can work across that boundary of self and other, whether we're talking about, for example, fractals or systems theories, the experience of death, that has the astrophysicists muse about being made of the same star stuff, whatever, something that traverses that boundary has the potential to speak to that. So echoing the anthropologist Natasha Myers, who's attempted to vegetalize concepts of agency through looking at plant sensing phenomena, I wonder what aspects of teaching become more salient and or newly configured, and what pedagogic phenomena do they bring into focus if we think of psychedelics as teachers rather than tools. Okay, having set the scene a little, I want to draw on insights from my research as part of the Hopkins team, the Johns Hopkins team from 2013 to 15, and some subsequent ethnographic research at a Baltimore-based psychonautic center. I'm going to assume that you know the Hopkins setup pretty well. When I was there, we used retrospective interviews to seek out mechanisms of change by which participants in Matt Johnson's pilot smoking cessation trial perceived the study to have affected them, both in terms of how they stopped smoking, whether they stopped smoking, but also other effects on them. This open-label study entailed 2 or 3 moderate to high-dose psilocybin sessions housed within a 15-week psychotherapeutic protocol. Since the research project, since 2015, I've become more interested in the period immediately following psychedelic experiences. And as part of that, I spent some time at a center called Be Free Floating in a space informally known as Tarantula Hill, run by Twig Harper in West Baltimore. This is about 7 miles west of the Hopkins Research Unit and in many ways a world apart. Amidst blocks of mostly vacant housing in a poor African-American neighborhood, Twig ran a psychonautic healing space centered upon a sensory isolation or float tank and a memory-augmenting psychotherapy assisted by the use of a tailored, bucolically administered extract of the atypical psychedelic Salvia divinorum, which is legal in both Maryland and federally. I would, just to point out, so the top right, that's the flotation tank. The top left is the kind of entranceway area you come into, and that's Twig in it. And then the bottom left is the kind of equipment that he uses to extract the salvia paste from leaves. And the bottom right is a kind of dose ready to go in the salvia room. I'm going to skip this despite it being a kind of spot the difference issue thing, which I quite like. But there are important differences across the two sites, but I don't really want to try like pretend that they're the same in any way. But I'm going to move straight on to talking about some themes that emerged across both of them. So in the time that remains, but I'm happy to talk about the differences between the sites if anyone wants to talk about them. I'm in the middle of this project, so it'd be nice to talk about this stuff. So in the time that remains, and just from using data from these two sites as in an illustrative way, I want to sketch one formulation of psychedelic teaching in terms of a trickster pedagogy. The idea is meant to emphasize how psychedelics often don't teach in straightforward ways. This may be familiar to us. Ayahuasca has been described as the greatest teacher and the worst of liars, or the best of liars. Psychedelics teach by claiming they have nothing to teach. We find deeply meaningful experiences become understood differently over time, and thereby we tend to, in the clinical context, they get referred to less as true than as what we need to hear. Get that formulation. I'm going to offer 3 themes for understanding how psychedelics teach in a Western context through a trickster pedagogy, and all of them, I think, kind of pretty independent of the content of people's experiences. So the first is through an agency that invites mystery. In a largely non-animist Western context, psychedelic experiences are perplexing, I think, in a particular kind of way. At the end of a psychedelic session, one can wonder if one did all the work for free, if the psychedelic really spoke, or if it was all me, after all, a masterful work of projection. This consideration of the aliveness of the psychedelic substance loops in less techne, as a form of knowledge, so much as a lively kind of mystery. And here's a quote from a Hopkins participant I interviewed. There's a question in my mind about how is a hallucinogenic experience real? And because it seems very, very real. I mean, if your body disassembles and becomes part of the universe and you feel comfortable about it, you still know in the back of your mind that it occurred in some dream state in your head. And it does sort of shatter the validity of the thought. On the other hand, it's such a calming thought that it's only logical to accept it. At Tarantula Hill, with the more mellow effects of the salvia extract and the sensory isolation tank, Twig explicitly understands the salvia space and the float tank as mirroring technologies. As mirroring technologies, he finds that people often wonder if they're just making it all up, or just making it up. To this, Twig's response is, yes, of course, and then he always adds, you're making it all up. The curious and inquiring state of mind that contemplates the agency of the psychedelic might help to explain, perhaps, the placebo effect, constituting as it does an active rather than a passive orientation to the healing process. Paradoxically, to resolve the mystery may be to ruin it, for its productivity lies in what the dynamic allows for. That movement is where meaning is made and narrative plots are thickened. Secondly, psychedelics teach through an authority that demands attention. The rarefied mystical experience is defined in part in terms of noesis, feeling more real than real. But authoritativeness is part of all psychedelic experiences, whether they're dazzling, uncanny, disturbing, or any of the above. The authority figure, as with the teacher, speaks on behalf of something beyond our grasp, such that we're brought into a relation of trust with it. Even with terrifying psychedelic experiences, we're compelled to make sense of what just happened. They're authoritative in that sense of advice one would not safely ignore. The idea here is that we don't learn automatically, but actively pay attention to psychedelic experiences in order to do so. Through his own experiences with salvia, Twig talks about how the spirit of salvia seduced him. Seduction is not always positive. It implies a lack of agency as we're pulled into a zone of attraction, whether we like it or not. By contrast, the labor of attending to experiences in the Hopkins pilot study was for some participants even between their sessions, when they felt the stakes were high and they needed to face their fears, or in entering a second session more prepared after failing to uphold the guide's mantra of trust, let go, and be open in the first session. One participant even trained. I meditated for 9 hours a day for a week before I did the second session. I actually took off from work with the intention of going in and playing a different kind of role. Yep, with the intention. I was very intentional in the second one of like, I'm going to face up to these images that I was hiding away from. I planned how I was going to go into the second session very carefully. And then I'm going to skip a. And then in the longer term, it's about articulating life commitments dialogically in social context through sharing with others and working it out in integration or follow-up sessions. Crucially, it's not simply a willing of attention. If ongoing containers for translating the significance of an experience forward are not present, it won't endure. Such containers are necessarily material, social, economic, technological. The trickster pedagogy highlights that things keep changing, that experience needs new containers appropriate to it, and the content of experience morphs as it's worked upon. Committing to it is committing to something that changes, that can indeed be exposed as the most masterful of liars. And third, psychedelics teach through a rearticulation rather than a solving of problems. Much has been made of the idea that psychedelics tell us something we could not possibly have known, the idea of the download or info dump or whatever. I think it's more productive in a Western context to identify how psychedelics can rearticulate rather than solve problems. Where conventional pedagogy follows what Paulo Freire calls the banking model of education, where the teacher knows and the students don't, and the teacher kind of banks knowledge into the student. Critical pedagogy looks at the reformulation of frameworks of understanding and their co-constitution. As those of you who are in the digital art workshop on Thursday would have heard from Android Jones, psychedelic problems are not solved, with psychedelics, problems are not solved, but reshaped, let go of, dissolved. Illuminations may not be about the sacred alone, but also the profane. What if this space is salvia space, or this world is the same one revealed through the mystical experience? Some of the insights gained in the smoking cessation trial at Hopkins can be understood as uncanny, perennialist, or both, as realizing what was already known rather than learning something new. For instance, did I learn anything new? Have I done anything totally different than I ever did before? No. But I'm sort of going back into my old, go back into some earlier experiences. And I guess I'd say poetry being one, my tolerance and everything else. It's as if I'm going back to my earlier life when I probably was a better person, to be honest with you. I think of the classic description by Richard Alpert, if you know it, of his first psilocybin experience, where what he realized was that he did not know. How does that make sense in terms of the rearticulation rather than solving of problems? Rather than finding a way to show that one does not know, it's about embracing not knowing. Following Anna Luke, this might be about turning instead to what matters when we know we're in the dark, perhaps a turn to the tactile, a building of trust. For others, this not knowing becomes a new kind of knowing that we don't know, or for Andrew Feldmar, that nobody knows, which could also be a kind of trusting that we don't know. The guide can be central, even in the Western context, for the reformulation rather than solving of problems. Mary Cosimano, who's speaking now at Hopkins, describes how the job of the guide is to join with, encouraging participants to welcome everything in experience, letting them know that you are with them. She says it's encouraging people to feel emotions rather than to double them, which would be to be afraid of the fear or angry at the anger or anxious about the anxiety. Mary describes how feeling feelings is the only way to manifest them, otherwise one's not moved by them and they don't change. She recollects many times when she stopped participants during follow-up meetings and also beyond, who are telling her what they've been up to in perhaps fairly uninspired kind of prose to help them reevaluate their actions, saying, "Do you realize what you just said? Take a moment and think about it." Pausing to feel the feelings is part of the integration work, both immediately afterwards and down the road. Meanwhile, Twig has honed a craft of creating onward containers to extend experiences people have had at Tarantula Hill. For example, he kind of works on iterating salvia and tank sessions, and the last time we spoke, talked about installing a smells cabinet where people could smell various tinctures before a salvia session, smell them afterwards, and see if the memories that are evoked are different. So in this way, a form of translating the kind of the altered state experiences forwards. These practices suggest that experiences are remade across thresholds of time and space through creative formulation, intellectual understanding, and pausing to fully feel the feelings. I think Scott Hill's book on Jung and psychedelics is really good in this regard. I recommend that. Okay, so my main aim was not to find a conception of psychedelics that would persuade educators that they be used as such, as Ken Tupper and others have sought. Instead, we've considered psychedelics as teachers by way of the idea of a trickster pedagogy to show that it offers another frame through which to interpret the current research, one less liable to individualist, automatizing tendencies, and friendlier to addressing the work of integration as an essential component of what makes them meaningful. I've suggested the clinical research and serious psychonautic use of psychedelics make demands upon attention, inviting the contemplation of mystery and new ways to reformulate old problems. These or similar dimensions could be operationalized as part of how we document integration. I want to end with a couple of other suggestions for the expanding number of clinical trial protocols. Advancing clinical trials to a stage where people will be mandated to use psychedelic therapy is a risky application of a method the critical pedagogue Jacques Rancière calls stultification. It's risky because these interventions do not consistently produce any particular kind of experience, and stultifying because it proposes an explicable causal model of how healing does work, rather than setting the stage for an emancipatory experiment in how healing can work. There's occasional reference to emancipation in the psychedelics community. Andrew Feldmar explicitly argues for it, remaining concerned about how the standardization of the guide protocols encourages a transference, the idea that the guide knows best, much as in medical procedures the doctor knows best. Clinical trials are not designed to hone in on enduring emancipatory processes. For reasons of efficiency, expediency, and liability minimization, they cut off contact with participants whose value lies in the data they produce. If this gets translated into service provision, so that one day, quote-unquote, psychedelic spas let people leave without sufficient guidance and resources for shaping how they integrate the experience afterwards, the creative joy of learning from psychedelic teachings may fuel the desire to return, to re-experience the psychedelic state. If we don't want psychedelics to be addictive in the West, we have to find ways to articulate better the paths that extend their teachings. As things stand, the FDA-approved model of carefully screened participants in controlled trials will continue to yield data on the correlations and mechanisms in both the basic and applied sciences of psychedelics. But once trial subjects have completed studies in accordance with FDA-approved methodologies, how might a more comprehensive, thorough follow-up study documenting the variables discussed here help to revise, trouble, and expand our understandings of psychedelics? One idea would be to emphasize participant feedback models where irregular feedback can be welcomed and not sidelined. It's crucial that the feedback is not stifled by the rigidity of the windows of its measurement. Ideally, we would be studying the continued growth of participants rather than simply treating additional feedback as addendums to outputs predetermined and discretely measured. And secondly, rather than explaining what psychedelics do, which is the mode of explication, we could tell more stories about how they've done what they've done. This mode of communication, storytelling, is often trivialized among the scientific researchers, perhaps associated with the underground use of psychedelics as trip reports that sensationalize and promote psychedelics use. But for those who seek help, stories work where explanations are lacking. As Martin Shaw said, the Sufis say, when even the prayers don't work anymore, it's time for a story. Well, what would an archive of stories of clinical study experiences do? To the extent that the underground research already provides access to stories of healing, clinical cases could do this too, but in ways that emphasize setting, guiding, integration practices. Such case studies would fill the gap between trial results as currently published in journals and what is essentially promotional material for shifting public opinion in line with the medicalization 1.0 strategy and for trial recruitment purposes. These could be the stories that would populate the classroom textbooks of tomorrow. Okay, thanks very much. Some acknowledgements. Huh? That's nice. Oh, that's nice. That's nice.
We have time only for one question. Any candidates? Come up here.
Or compliments. It's really a work in progress, so it'd be really nice to chat to anyone who's interested. And, yeah. You get in touch with me, my email as well. That's obvious.
Hi there.
Hi.
Can you please say more, if you're able to, about the specific trickster energies of various substances?
Specific substances?
Yeah, for example, mushrooms, for example, LSD.
Yeah, I don't know that I could, to be honest, but I would love to do that. I've been, because of the methodology, I mean, I wouldn't even say that I would been one of the research sites was mushrooms, because it's, psilocybin, and I wouldn't want to say that it's the same thing necessarily. And I guess I've been more focused about the practices that are used in order to make sense of the experiences rather than like something intrinsic to the substances themselves. But that's not to say that there isn't something there, and that, I mean, I'd be really interested to look into that more. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really inspiring. I also love the image of the plants as teachers. I think that's really valuable to be looking at. And then also looking at our relationship with teacher. I'm just wondering if you have, or if it would be interesting to then experiment with shifting that role, because how we look at teacher and student, so then maybe like role reversal and in the work.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah. What would it mean to teach a psychedelic? I mean, it's really interesting. But I wonder, because I think I'm sorry, the previous presentation was by Laura. Laura was talking about participatory modes of research, collaborative modes of research. On the one hand, we can think about a kind of enriched ecology of research where lots of different research paradigms are at play. But what would it mean to do one research project where all of these different human, non-human voices are kind of actively heard and sort of enfolded? That's really, really exciting prospect. But and it's nice to think that there are a few different kind of presenters here or people here who are kind of thinking in that direction. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and we have a lunch break and pick up at 2 again. Thank you.
Thanks.